Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flowchat from mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us. Lots and lots of stuff going on today. We're going to zip right through it. Got a lot of ground to cover. First off, most significantly, as of breaking news today, E3, or the otherwise known as the Entertainment Electronics Industry Expo, which has been around for a very, very long time, has officially announced that this year it is canceled. We've reported on in previous shows how there was basically problems running for this year's convention, as it was supposed to be the big return to in-person conventions at the LA Convention Center for it after the several years of the pandemic, and they had to cancel numerous times for very obvious reasons. And a lot of the major publishers and distributors basically didn't want to be a part of it. And the exact reasons we'll probably not know for a long time. I would cynically guess it has to do with costs. Maybe it was they didn't want to spend what it cost to basically be able to exhibit there on the show floor, or maybe E3 didn't make it attractive enough for them to make it worth it. But already, kind of coming along the last few years that E3 had happened, there was major publishers that weren't really intending on being a part of it, and not the least of which being Sony Electronic Arts, and then more recently Nintendo. Well, the news got worse this year as Xbox, who had always kind of been a part of E3, at least since Xbox's inception, had basically decided they didn't want to be a part of it anymore. And now the news came just in the last couple of days that both Sega and Ubisoft, along with Tencent, didn't want to be a part of E3 this year, and they decided they weren't going to be a part of it. And so rumblings have come through the pipeline, and effectively IGN had the scoop indicating that E3 was canceled. They couldn't get enough adoption. It's not enough major publishers coming, and it's just not happening. Now, if you're not a gamer and you're not familiar with this world and what this means, E3 was always kind of meant to be an industry trade thing, but it was for people who like video games. It was the stuff of legend. It was essentially South by Southwest for video games. You could go to a place like that and play amazing first run things that nobody anywhere had seen or touched and wouldn't come out for about a year and a half, sometimes 2 years. So it was like getting the most incredible private special experience in the world. Now, this started as an offshoot the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas, the giant CES convention, and it was originally kind of a satellite thing, and then it spun off to its own thing and became what we commonly know as E3. And for a long, long time, it was an amazing, amazing thing. But little by little, these big publishers, the companies like Sony and Nintendo, essentially started coming to the conclusion that it just wasn't worth it for them. And I don't know, maybe if you're Sony and you run PlayStation and you dominate the market as far as first party video game and console sales, it's why spend tens of millions of dollars doing it? You're going to make a ton of money anyways. Now, exactly their reasoning, exactly the true purpose, that will probably come out someday long in the future. We can only really speculate as to that. But unfortunately, right now, it's just not going to happen. So this thing that was a luminous part of the video game world every year is just done. Now, they have said in some level that they will continue on, but the limited information that's kind of leaked through the reporting through IGN was a statement, an email that they gave to their own people saying simply did not garner the sustained interest necessary to execute it in a way that would showcase the size, strength, and impact of our industry. Now, kind of one of the things that has been happening in the last few years is the luminary Jeff Keighley, who is, kind of his own cottage industry in the world of video games, has been on other networks like G4 TV, but also ran his own site, Game Slice, for a lot of years. He is basically the person who made happen the Game Awards, which is the big annual event that, is meant to be like the Oscars for video games, become a giant sensation, a huge part of what the video game industry means. And he has started over the last few years kind of his own event. He used to be a part of E3. He used to do things in a live stream in E3. And about 4 years back, he split off from it. And he has this new thing called Summer Games Fest. Now, last year, me and a couple other people from Mixdown Games had a chance to go. It was a delight. It was really cool. It was entirely just kind of a press experience. And it was entirely aimed at, meeting with the publishers who were there that had games, most of them in a little smaller kind of independent varietal, but effectively to just sample the games, play them, talk to them, talk to the creators. It was great. We'll talk a little bit more about E3 at the end of the show, but I want to move on to our next story because it's kind of a doozy and it connects to a couple different things as well. Disney, now run again by Bob Iger as opposed to Bob Chapek. Basically, Bob Chapek had taken over from Bob Iger after many years of him being the CEO, and apparently people weren't super happy with what Bob Chapek was doing. He got removed as CEO, and then Bob Iger came out of retirement to run it again. And along with a lot of things in terms of the slowdown of the economy in the wake of the end of the pandemic, essentially announced he was going to do a whole bunch of things as cost-cutting mechanisms to try to basically help, I don't know, I guess put money back in the coffers or save money as far as Disney's expenses, curtail, profits not matching what hopefully they were expecting. And so one of the first things that they basically announced a couple months ago is they were going to be laying off 7,000 people. That's not chump change, but of course Disney is a gigantic operation, and they have their theme parks, they have their own merchandise businesses, they have their media businesses, there's the whole movie chain, they also own what was the remnants of the Fox studios for movies, all kinds of different businesses under the Disney umbrella. So almost everything was impacted in some respect. This was the first of 3 rounds that are going to total those 7,000 employees in terms of their layoffs. Iger issued a memorandum to the company and had a few choice things to say. As I shared with you in February, we made the difficult decision to reduce our overall workforce by approximately 7,000 jobs as part of a strategic realignment of the company. He also said this week we begin notifying employees whose positions are impacted by the company's workforce reductions. A second larger round of notifications will happen in April with several thousand more staff reductions, and we expect to commence the final round of notifications before the beginning of the summer to reach our 7,000 job target. So no matter what, 7,000 less people will be working for the company by the time that August comes around. Now, this is interesting also because it's a kind of a nerdy subdivision of politics within the whole Disney Marvel Studios apparatus. Now, for those of you that aren't really, really big fans of comic books or superhero movies, essentially one of the things that happened many years ago is Marvel Comics, which had always kind of licensed movies and everything, was essentially on the point of bankruptcy in the 90s. It had just run out of gas and essentially was purchased by an independent businessman named Ike Perlmutter. Now, Ike Perlmutter had this company, basically helped bring it back to life through his partnership with another company he owned called Toy Biz, and it kind of merged them together and then essentially kind of very happily had the business. He controlled Marvel and whatever Marvel meant or whatever Marvel did. Now, movies started getting made, Spider-Man and the X-Men in the late 90s, that started becoming a bigger success. Bob Iger, who also is the person behind the Star Wars acquisition at Disney in general, was the one that had kind of convinced Ike Perlmutter to sell Marvel as a whole to Disney. And then, of course, the rest is history. And back way back in 2009, Disney purchased whatever was left of Marvel at that point that hadn't been licensed or sold off already for about $4 billion from Perlmutter. Now, Perlmutter stayed on with the company and became a part of that original brain trust that led to the very successful movies and Iron Man and then, of course, the monstrosity that was Avengers. Now, a few years later, in about 2015, there was famously a big power struggle between the various different people who controlled what Marvel Studios' output was. And effectively, there was kind of like a push or shove moment. And for whatever reason, Bob Iger and the other brass at Disney essentially decided Kevin Feige, who you probably hear about all the time as being the impresario of all of these Marvel films and the creative brain trust behind making sure they're good, essentially won. And Perlmutter was taken out of control of any of the Marvel movie studio projects, and to a lesser extent became in charge just of Marvel Entertainment, which was basically everything that wasn't Marvel Studios as the film studio is concerned. And essentially, one of the things that was part of that for a little while was what was known as the TV properties. This is before Disney Plus. So this is where your Daredevils, your Jessica Jones, your very horrible Inhumans, and then, of course, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. were all properties that were run kind of under his banner through a different person other than Kevin Feige, which was Jeff Loeb. Now, of course, eventually Disney Plus happened. Anything that was Disney TV was either scuttled or terminated or canceled and then brought all in-house under Kevin Feige's umbrella of Marvel Studios as a part of trying to push so hard on Disney Plus. Well, Ike Perlmutter, the person who had sold Marvel to Disney, who had saved Marvel at one point, not defending Ike Perlmutter, I don't know the guy or anything, but just, for the record, was the person that saved it from bankruptcy and kept it running until the movie monstrosity made it a big business again, has been let go as a part of these layoffs. These 7,000 people to go, him and many of the top brass at Marvel Entertainment have been terminated as a part of this reduction to try to save, I guess, $5.5 billion. And then essentially, what was left of Marvel Entertainment and whatever divisions have been kind of pushed into other areas of Disney. Just to be clear, for any of you who aren't super familiar with this politics, Marvel Studios is the film studio that controls the Marvel movies you hear about all the time that make so much money. And that is run as a separate division within Disney, separate from the Marvel Entertainment division. So now other arms of Disney have absorbed basically everything else that Marvel Comics and Marvel Entertainment is, whatever those kinds of things, licensing, publishing, comic books, that have all been absorbed by different divisions. Now, elsewhere in the world of music, really, really, really interesting. Now, for those of you who are fans of Coachella. Big market, mass market music festivals. Coachella's put on by a company called Golden Voice. Golden Voice is owned by an even bigger company called AG, Anschutz Entertainment Group. And essentially, Coachella, I guess not enough. And some years ago, AG and Golden Voice started putting on other festivals in the same location at what is the Empire Polo Fields, this gigantic series of empty fields that's, where the stomping ground is, that is the massive and incredible Coachella Festival. And so over the years, they've started adding satellite things into there, not the least of which being Stagecoach, which is like the country music equivalent. Usually there's a few kind of like mainstream alternative things that kind of peck in there sometimes. Like one year Lil Nas X played along with Diplo at Stagecoach, but otherwise it's a country music festival. Same exact place. Some years back, I had the good fortune of being there for another thing that was called the Big Four Festival. The Big Four Festival was the Big Four of thrash. They went all over Europe and all over the world and sold out giant open air crowds everywhere. And that was, of course, Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and Anthrax, the original big four thrash metal bands from the American heyday of the 80s. Okay. That happened just once. That was an ongoing thing. So some years ago, there was another event, which was essentially called Desert Trip. And it was kind of like classic rock heritage acts. And it was, Bob Dylan, and it was Roger Waters, and it was like, The Who. And it was basically, the best of the classic rock era that's still alive, that was still here. And it was 3 days, and there were 2 bands performing every day. Well, today, Golden Voice announced, not to be outdone, I guess you could call it classics of recent era. I mean, because it's not currently modern, famous, super huge bands, but it's just the previous generation. And they've announced what's called the Power Trip Festival. Nothing to do with the wonderful throwback thrash metal band Power Trip that the lead singer Riley Gale died a couple years ago during the pandemic of, still to my knowledge, unstated reasons and causes. But the Power Trip Festival will take place October 6th of this year through October 8th of this year in 2023. And across 3 days, each of these days there'll be 2 bands. And as far as it looks like, there probably won't be any other openers or support acts on the day. But Friday is going to feature Guns N' Roses and Iron Maiden together. I don't know how the hell that's going to work and who's going to headline in that situation. And then AC/DC and Ozzy Osbourne, a little bit more obvious. Obviously, AC/DC goes last there. And then lastly, Metallica and Tool. That's an impressive series of 6 bands if you have tolerance for this kind of music. If you're into hard rock and quasi-metal or art metal, if it's Tool, that's about as great as 6 bands as you're going to see over 3 days if you're into that kind of thing. What's really interesting is that Tool is famously one of the few bands, as far as any kind of stature of band, hard rock-wise or metal-wise, that since Megadeth and Metallica burst out to the arena level, Tool can sell out almost an amphitheater. An amphitheater is usually bigger than an arena. Arena is usually between 14 and 17,000 seats, unless it's a really big one like the United Center in Chicago. And essentially, Tool can go and play the sheds, the amphitheaters. We've talked about them in previous shows. That's like the Verizon Wireless Amphitheater down south from here, the San Manuel Amphitheater out east from here, or back in Connecticut where I grew up, the Meadows Music Theater, the CT Now Music Theater, where essentially there's seats, ticketed seats, and then a giant lawn. A giant lawn that spreads on can just be filled with more and more and more people. They can scale up to 27 or 32,000 people. Tool played an event, admittedly backed by Primus and Clutch, Fantomas and the Melvins, and just a whole bunch of great bands, where they sold out one by themselves, which is really, really an accomplishment. So it's kind of a thing of like, Metallica has been an arena level band for a long time, and they're obviously deserving of all the credit and praise that they get. But who's going to headline on Sunday? If Metallica and Tool are playing the same day, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be the one having to make that decision or navigate with management and stuff like that in terms of things like that. And just to wrap up with a couple of short notes here before we go on to this week's story. HBO's Succession is another massive hit for HBO, and as far as the network and the streaming platform is concerned. And the show chronicles the travails of the Roy family as they're fighting over control of Waystar Royco, their company that their father had basically implemented and created, and who gets to inherit it. And essentially, the show in its new season premiere that just happened this weekend had its own record high debut of 2.3 million people watching. And that's not chump change by any means. That's a pretty big number. Just to give you a sense of comparison standpoint, The Last of Us, which we talked about a lot on this show, and that is the big new hit from HBO after, House of the Dragon the previous year. That debut episode, which didn't have the foundation that Succession has had building up acclaim as seasons have gone on, and of course, Emmy Award winning, performances in the meantime, did 4.7 million viewers for its first episode. So Still a massive accomplishment and another bona fide hit for the network, but, not as big as some of the other shows that are there. And then lastly, just to kind of bring an update to a story we talked about a few weeks ago, Pussy Riot's Nadya Tolokonnikova has now officially been placed on a wanted list by Russian authorities. Now, it's complicated. Russia has all kinds of draconian laws that Vladimir Putin has pushed to enact, which essentially, if you do or say anything that they don't like, you can be arrested. Famously, there was a story this week about how a man is now in an open air prison detention center after his daughter drew a painting that said, "No war, war is bad." And essentially, she got pushed into an orphanage, and now he's in a gulag of sorts. So Pussy Riot has been long on the front lines of standing up against Putin and, what he's done. And they were arrested several times. There's many members of the collective. They've all faced all kinds of harassment, both from the authorities and from just government supporters in the country. And of course, Nadya, who has been long outspoken against Putin and the crimes of his administration in terms of running Russia, has not been living in Russia for some time and is here in America or in other places abroad. And so earlier this year in January, one of our writers, Connie Chavez, basically attended an event that was called Putin's Ashes. And it was kind of an art gallery event, different kinds of art, different kinds of things they were doing. And within that, there was this part where they showed a video. There was like a big painting or a portrait or a picture of Vladimir Putin, and they burned it. And, essentially that was why it was called Putin's Ashes. So shortly after that, Tolokonnikova announced via her Instagram channel that she knew that she was likely going to be facing charges. She didn't know exactly what it was that had, outraged Putin or the Russian authorities. A little more detail has come out about that. And so first and foremost, of course, now the authorities officially want to arrest her. So here's to hoping on some small level she doesn't go anywhere where they have the ability to have extradition. Here's to hoping she doesn't go back to Russia. I mean, Alexei Navalny, who's famously the opposition leader against Vladimir Putin, wasn't willing to back down for anything, basically after being poisoned and almost murdered abroad. As soon as he was healed and recovered enough, came straight back to Russia. He got locked up. He's been in a prison and has had multiple hunger strikes and almost died numerous times since, just willing to stand up to, Putin's tyranny. So here's to hoping that Tolokonnikova doesn't go back, because she's surely going to be in the same kind of situation. They will probably happily throw her in prison and probably never let her out this time, because nothing seems to matter when there's the question of them wanting to invade Ukraine. So essentially, it's kind of been vaguely hinted that something to do with the event Putin's Ashes that I mentioned a minute ago might have had something to do with it, and maybe that was a part of the connection of what the problem is. But then there's also an indication from their team that it might be has to do with images that were on her Instagram account that the government deems offensive to Christianity. Here's to hoping that Tolokonnikova and everyone from Pussy Riot stays safe. Just even talking about what Vladimir Putin and Russia, what he's doing on behalf of Russia, scares even me. And I'm not a Russian citizen. I'm not the kind of person who's out on the front lines of this issue. Hopefully she and everyone in the band stays safe. Now, lastly, before we wrap up here this week, I basically wanted to circle back to the first story. I was going to talk about any number of other things this week, but E3 got canceled. And it feels like if there was ever a time to talk about why E3 was special and what it meant, this was the time. So just by way of a short story, back in the day, it was always kind of a thing of revered legend, if you were interested in video games, that all the most exciting and cool stuff tended to happen at E3 at the LA Convention Center. So now when I came out to Los Angeles and I started setting up my life here and started working and trying to be able to, afford to exist here and, of course, pay student loans at that phase of my life shortly after coming out of college, how could I get to this thing? Now, at the time, I worked for a company called PriceGrabber.com, and PriceGrabber.com had a little bit to do with the video game industry. There were video game listings and, help sell video games across different retailers who sold video games. So we were part of the industry. In those days, unless you were press, unless you were media, you could only really be at E3 if you could prove you were a part of the video game industry. You had to submit a form, you had to fax it in, you basically had to be able to document how, where you were at that company, you had to provide a business card showing you were definitely a person at that company, and then otherwise you couldn't be there. Now, working with people that I knew at the company who had gone, they showed me how to do it. I went, and I think I took a couple days off from work at this point. This was before Mixdown is what it is now, and it was bananas. I mean, it was a kind of a free-for-all and a giant adult playground. I mean, like Pleasure Island in that Pinocchio sense of things, except without maybe so much cigar smoke. And ostensibly, everywhere you looked, it was like Vegas-style events and booths and presentations that showed off different things that were going on. The very first time I went, I only went for a day. And then the next year I went all 3 days, and I took a bunch of days off for work. But the very first time that I was there, the now legendary game Alan Wake, I walked in the room basically the first time they were showing it to anybody. And I got to be there the very first time they showed footage of it after many years of working and building it. And then, the next time that I went, I got to go all 3 days and basically spent, a certain day just going around a whole hallway doing every single thing I possibly could. And I remember the first thing I saw that year when I came in, and this is for you gamers out there, and I'm sure some music people have tuned out from this show by now, but effectively for you gamers out there, the first thing I saw was Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. Now this was like the least of the things that I saw that year, and essentially there was like a little jungle that they'd set up with fake trees, and but it looked pretty convincing, and each tree had a PlayStation console built into it. And then there was a game that didn't come out for almost 2 years after that, in Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, and you could play a whole giant section of it. And there wasn't much in the way of instruction. It was just there. There wasn't a line. There wasn't any like, how do you do this? You just rolled up. There was a tree. There was a controller. You got to play the game. Everywhere you went, you got to see something special and exciting. There were early, demonstrations of Resident Evil 4, which is legendary in the world of games now. There was The Legend of Zelda, the Wind Waker, the one with the wolf, and effectively, the only thing that I don't think really happened in those days was, Rockstar Games, who's kind of, with Grand Theft Auto, essentially one of the biggest game companies as an independent publisher of any sort that there is. And they didn't really demonstrate things in those days. They'd have a presence there. They'd have like school buses or things like that, but they didn't really do things where anyone could really rock up to it unless you were media and they were showing you something special. But one of the things I always like to remember, so growing up, I was a big fan of Cartoon Network when I was in high school. And I used to love, essentially, Cartoon Planet, and then most importantly, Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And which, if you're not familiar with those shows, were basically a redux on those early kind of Hanna-Barbera cartoons done with modern voice actors. And they'd have real life human guests as little TVs, like it was a talk show. But then they were just ridiculous characters. Space Ghost being just completely full of himself and kind of dim-witted. And then his prisoners, the villains, Moltar and Zorak, essentially being his Ed McMahon type characters. And then, real celebrities, everyone from Pavement to Tom York to Bjork to John Popper from Blues Traveler, Randy Macho Man Savage sometimes. So one time in E3, we're rolling around, and then all of a sudden there's like a stage set up, and they're like, everyone stand around. We're going to have Space Ghost here in just a minute. And there was literally, I'm assuming the voice actor was somewhere live, behind backstage in a closet or something with a camera showing what was going on in front of everyone. And essentially, they had a stage set up where they had guests, and the guy that was the head of Microsoft at the time, I'm totally forgetting his name offhand, but effectively came up as a guest. And literally, they did a live improvised Space Ghost show in front of the crowd, just randomly right there on the E3 floor. And I guess they did it multiple times a day. They had different guests from the game industry, and I think they had the guy from Microsoft participate in a dance contest. It was jaw-dropping to be able to experience that and to be there for something like that in person. I spent so many years staying up till like 3 o'clock in the morning, hoping to see Space Ghost when I was growing up. And effectively, here I am wandering around playing video games, getting free t-shirts, and there's a live performance that nobody even talked about, wasn't even announced. Other things in those days was there's a band that we used to cover a lot in the old days at Mixdown. In fact, you can see it right above my head right here. This is Tweaker, which is a wonderful band that hasn't been so active in recent years, fronted by a guy named Chris Brenna. He used to be the drummer for Nine Inch Nails, and one year he was just a part of a live stage show, drumming and playing keyboards as part of a band, as part of, advertising some MMORPG game that Lord British was doing at the time. It was a fascinating little piece of history. And everywhere you looked, there was creativity. There was an effort to try to prove themselves. And then little by little, they started to have it. The bar got reduced. And then more and more people started to be able to come. And then eventually they started opening up ticketing for people to be able to pay to be able to come. And then it went from being this thing where you got to have limited experiences playing games to people were lining up for hours just to look at a trailer of a game for 5 minutes. And, if you had to be media to basically be able to see anything. You had to make arrangements and press appointments and stuff like that. And so little by little, that dynamic changed. It got bigger and bigger and more complicated. It got harder and harder to experience things. And, little by little, of course, these big developers that I talked about in the beginning of the show started to step back, and they started to leave because of that. But when it was going, whatever little magic was happening there where everyone just knew this is where we had to be, Oh my God. It was the most amazing thing ever. It's hard to believe anything like that was even possible and that you could just go around and do that and have that experience. Like just the best adult arcade in history. Now, it was obvious the last few years that it was happening because you got a lot less stuff like limited experiences like that and more like photo opportunities. Like here, take a picture pretending you're riding, a light speeder, and take a picture like you're in front of one of the villains from Doom. And there was a lot less stuff that was aimed at being a part of experiential video games and being able to try things manually hands on. And it was kind of obvious that this was kind of what was coming, that it was becoming less about what it was and it was more like an experience for people and just for families. And, thankfully, I hinted at this in the beginning of the show, Jeff Keighley's Summer Games Fest. It wasn't anything on the scale last year when I attended that, E3 was in its glory days as far as size and stature. They didn't have Nintendo and Sony setting up to show things in limited capacity. But what it was had a little bit of that feeling. Like everywhere you looked, there was something cool to experience. There wasn't an insane line for doing things. I know that's hard to make happen at scale, but maybe something like this just can't. There are tens of millions of gamers out there. You can't cram 150,000 people into anything and have it be a comfortable experience. There's a reason some people never go to concerts and never go to festivals, and this is why. Because it can become an incredibly painful experience. So here's to hoping that if Summer Game Fest comes around this year and we're there to attend Summer Games Fest, it is a continuation of that level of quality and hopefully some of the steam that's coming off of E3, and rest in peace E3. I mean, for the Electronic Entertainment, the ESA, which is the Entertainment Software Association. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I had that right. Rest in peace to E3, and hopefully they can find some other kind of footing in some capacity or bring E3 back at some level and some different configuration, because it was a thing of magic and it's time. And here's to hoping that Summer Game Fest can pick up the torch and continue that thing of really building that wonderful experience where people who really have chops and want to show off cool and exciting new games have a place to do it. That's all for this week's episode of This Week is Live. We want to thank you again, as we have every week, for joining us. And essentially, wherever you kind of engage with our media, whether it's in YouTube, whether it's here in Twitch, whether it's, on Instagram or Facebook in the videos, or in Twitter, whenever place YouTube Shorts, wherever we share these videos, we want to thank you for joining us, for liking it, for sharing it. If you don't already, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Please follow us on Twitch. Anywhere and everywhere we share these things, share them far and wide. We are so pleased to have you with us in terms of enjoying the show. We're going to be back each and every week here Thursdays, usually around 5:30 p.m. or 6 p.m. Pacific time. And, of course, by extension of that, as I've been teasing for a while, we're going to have some new and exciting and different things coming. We're going to be doing a lot of different stuff this year, so brace yourself. There's going to be a lot more like this. I know I've been teasing it for a while, but it's all in the works. We'll get there, and you'll see soon enough what we're talking about. But until next time, thanks for joining us. So glad to see you well.